He called himself the living God, a man so obsessed with divinity he erased his humanity. Xerxes ruled not through mercy, but through fear, believing his bloodline was sacred even as he defiled it. He silenced priests, destroyed his own sons, and built temples to worship his reflection. But what happens when a man convinces the world he cannot die, and then learns that eternity is not a gift, but a sentence? This is not just the story of a king, it's the story of how immortality became mankind's most haunting punishment. If you think power corrupts, wait until you see what worship does. Subscribe and step into the stories history tried to bury. Because in every empire that fell, there's a name the gods refused to forgive. They said the king's summons was a blessing. Every girl raised under the roof of Persepolis was taught that being called to the royal chambers meant honor. Songs were written about it. Poets praised it, mothers prayed for it. But the woman standing before her daughter that night didn't pray. She trembled. She couldn't bring herself to speak the truth, that blessings from gods can destroy those too pure to understand their language. Amytas was 13, the youngest daughter of Xerxes. She was told she had been chosen to serve the will of the divine. Her mother repeated it carefully, as if speaking through a wound that had never healed. "When the eunuch comes, you will go," she said. "You must not resist. You must not cry. You must not speak unless he commands it." The girl frowned. "Why can't I speak?" Her mother's silence was her answer. From childhood, Amytas had seen her father only from afar, surrounded by priests, guards, and endless faces that bowed when he walked. He was not a man to her, but an image repeated in stories, in sculptures, and songs. She didn't know what it meant to be chosen by him. No one ever explained. Her mother smoothed her hair and whispered, "He will see you as the empire sees you, perfect, obedient, pure. You must make him proud." But her voice cracked on the last word. Pride had long been replaced by fear, though neither mother nor daughter could name it. The eunuch appeared at the doorway, silent as law. He did not announce himself. He never did. He simply waited until the mother bowed. Then he turned to the girl and said the words that froze her childhood forever. "The king is ready." Something inside her mother broke at that sentence, but she didn't move. She kept her eyes down, her hands clenched. To disobey the ritual was treason. Even love had boundaries under the shadow of Xerxes. Amytas walked forward because there was no choice. She had been told this was destiny. The priest said the king's blood was the blood of gods, and to share it was a holy act. But she didn't understand holiness that came wrapped in silence. She wanted to ask again, "Why me?" But the question was forbidden. When the door closed behind her, the mother fell to her knees. She didn't cry. She had learned long ago that tears were punishable in the presence of divinity. Instead, she whispered an old prayer no priest dared recite anymore, one that asked forgiveness for what holiness demanded. That night would never be recorded by historians. There would be no inscription on stone, no song of mourning, no rebellion, only silence. The kind of silence that holds its breath across generations, because the truth was simple and monstrous. Xerxes, king of kings, saw his own daughters not as children, but as extensions of divine lineage, vessels meant to preserve the purity of gods made flesh. No act was too sacred to be unspeakable. No boundary existed between faith and violation. The empire's priests had ensured that long ago. They had rewritten holiness into obedience. They had turned sin into ceremony. Every month, a name would be chosen from among the royal daughters. The chosen girl would vanish for a night and return before dawn, wrapped in silence. Her mother would not speak of it. Her sisters would not ask. They all understood. Words were dangerous in the presence of divinity. Sometimes the girls came back different, distant, eyes hollow, speech lost. Some refused food for days. One drowned herself in the courtyard fountain. But the palace never punished them for despair. Despair was acceptable. Only defiance was not. The priests called this the ritual of preservation. They claimed it sustained the divine order that kept Persia unconquered. The empire's grandeur was built upon it, marble, gold, and blood combined. The people outside the palace sang of their god-king's wisdom, never suspecting the god they worshipped was devouring his own creation. And in this deception lay Xerxes' true genius. He didn't need soldiers to maintain his power. He needed silence. The kind of silence that starts in a palace and spreads like disease until it becomes a virtue. Even the queen obeyed. Amestris, the only woman permitted to share the throne, understood what would happen if she spoke. She had tried once, early in their marriage, to question his divine claim. The priest summoned her within the hour. She emerged 3 days later, pale and quiet, and never challenged him again. Amidas's mother had seen that transformation. She knew what happened to women who asked why, and so she trained her daughter to survive by imitation. "Do not resist," she said. "You will only make it worse." The first time the eunuch came for her, Amadis froze. But over time, she stopped trembling. The silence became routine. And that was the greatest horror of all, when terror became normal. By the time she turned 16, the fear had turned into numbness. She no longer cried when summoned. She simply bowed her head, walked, and waited for it to end. The empire called this loyalty. History would later call it devotion. But in truth, it was surrender. The slow erasure of the human spirit disguised as piety. No record of her suffering exists in the tablets or scrolls. Her name appears only once in an archive list of women of divine service. That's how empires bury their daughters, not with stones, but with titles. And yet, centuries later, historians would struggle to understand why Xerxes' reign, glorious, vast, invincible, began to crumble not long after these rituals became common. They would blame his wars, his arrogance, his obsession with Greece, but none would see what truly broke his empire. It wasn't the loss of soldiers, it was the loss of souls, because every empire has a limit, not of land, but of conscience. And Xerxes crossed his long before he met a single Greek army. As the eunuch led Amidas deeper into the corridor that night, she asked in a whisper, "Does the king love us?" The eunuch hesitated, a flicker of emotion in a face trained to show none. "Love?" he said softly. "The king does not love, he remembers." "Remembers what?" "The blood," he replied. "Only the blood." The words echoed in her mind long after that night, long after the rituals became habit. She never saw them as abuse, not at first. She had been born into a world where worship and obedience were the same word, where fathers could be gods and gods could be cruel. And when she finally understood the truth, when she saw what the rituals had done to her sisters, it was too late to speak. She had inherited not power, but silence. Centuries later, historians would call Xerxes the Great. But those who knew his private rituals, those whose lives ended beneath the weight of his divinity, never called him that. They had another name for him, one whispered only in secret among the women of the palace, the god who defiled his own blood. There was a time when Xerxes was still human, before the crown melted his mind into gold, before he began to believe that his blood carried the language of gods. As a young prince, he had been taught that his body was sacred. His tutor spoke of him not as a boy, but as an heir to eternity. When he sneezed, it was considered an omen. When he bled, it was treated as a celestial offering. Every gesture, every word, was recorded as a sign of divine favor. He was not allowed to laugh too loud, nor cry too openly. Emotion was weakness. Divinity demanded restraint. From childhood, the priests called him Ahura's chosen vessel. They told him he had been conceived beneath the star of the golden line, a rare alignment said to mark the birth of immortal rulers. His father, Darius the Great, encouraged it. He knew an empire ruled more easily when its ruler was worshipped, not merely obeyed. And so the illusion began, a lie repeated so often it became indistinguishable from truth. When Darius died, Xerxes inherited not only the throne, but the burden of perfection. He was no longer a son or a man. He was the bridge between heaven and earth. To question him was to question the gods themselves. At first, he tried to live up to the myth. He prayed, fasted, studied the old laws. But reverence is a dangerous drug. The more he was worshipped, the more mortal he felt. And to hide that fragility, he demanded greater worship. It began subtly. Decrees that his name be spoken before any gods, statues where his image was carved larger than the divine figures beside him. The priests hesitated at first, but they soon realized what all courtiers learn: proximity to madness can be profitable. One priest, Arthabanes, the high seer, became the architect of Xerxes' divinity. He whispered to the king that doubt was impurity, and that impurity in the royal line could bring ruin to Persia. To maintain the sacred order, the king's blood must remain untainted, shared only with those who carried his divine lineage. That single whisper shaped a dynasty of horror. Arthabanes crafted scripture to justify it. He forged prophecies, altered rituals, erased contradictions. And because Xerxes demanded to believe, the empire believed with him. The illusion grew until it consumed everything. Those who dared question were branded as heretics. Some vanished quietly. Others were forced into public repentance before their families, confessing sins they hadn't committed just to protect them from wrath. But behind closed doors, Xerxes' own heart battled itself. He felt an emptiness he couldn't explain, a sickness of the soul disguised as divine hunger. The priest told him it was the weight of godhood, that mortal love or guilt could not coexist with eternity. And he believed them, because to reject their words was to face the truth, that he was a man pretending to be a god. That truth terrified him more than any army. He began to test his divinity, not with prayers, but with cruelty. A servant who disobeyed was ordered to kneel before him while Xerxes dipped his finger in blood and whispered, "See how the mortal obeys divine command." When the servant wept, he smiled. "Tears," he said, "are proof of my power." It was no longer about faith. It was about control, the ability to mold others into belief through fear. His counselors noticed the change, but none dared intervene. Every attempt to reason with him became a trap. He would test them, asking, "Do you believe I am divine?" And there was only one safe answer. The queen, Amestris, understood that game well. She had seen him destroy men not because they disbelieved, but because their faith wasn't convincing enough. The illusion demanded not only obedience, it demanded performance. But illusions, no matter how grand, always need reinforcement. So the priests created the ritual of bloodline preservation, the ceremony that would later define Xerxes' reign. They told him the gods spoke through him directly, and that their divine purity must never be diluted by mortal flesh. Only his blood could sustain heaven's favor. He hesitated at first. Even in his delusion, something human in him recoiled. But Arthabanes, the master of his faith, whispered again, "To share your blood is to keep the divine alive." That night, the first ritual was performed. It was said the moon did not rise, not because the sky was dark, but because even the heavens refused to witness. The next morning, Xerxes appeared radiant. The priests declared that his face shone with the light of Ahura himself. The empire rejoiced. But those who looked closely saw the truth in his eyes. Not radiance, but fever. A burning need to repeat the ritual, to feed the illusion that his body was no longer bound by human law. Over time, the rituals became doctrine. No priest could question them, no historian could record them accurately. Generations later, scholars would argue whether they even happened. But within the palace, everyone knew, and no one dared speak, because in the empire of Xerxes, silence was survival. What no one saw was that beneath the crown, he was unraveling. He began to hear voices in his prayers. The same ones that had once comforted him now whispered accusations. "You are not divine," they hissed. "You are defiled." He would spend nights alone, pacing, muttering to the gods who no longer answered. When they remained silent, he punished others to silence them too. If he could not hear the gods, he would become one himself. That was the essence of Xerxes' illusion, a man so terrified of mortality that he tried to erase every reminder of it. Women were forbidden to age in his presence. Servants were not allowed to die where he could see them. Even old advisors were quietly replaced with younger faces so that time itself would bow before him. He once told Arthabanes, "If I stop believing I am divine, the world will end." The priest bowed deeply and replied, "Then, my king, you must never doubt again." But deep within, Xerxes already knew the truth. The world wouldn't end if he doubted. Only his illusion would, and that, to him, was the same thing. By the time his empire stretched from Egypt to India, Xerxes no longer ruled men. He ruled shadows, reflections of himself. The priests, the courtiers, even the queen, all became mirrors to his madness. They existed only to reinforce what he already believed. He had built a kingdom so vast it could not be conquered, except by his own mind. And when that conquest began, it was silent, as all great downfalls are. There are certain truths that even empires try to bury, truths so venomous they corrode memory itself. The story of Xerxes' lineage was one such truth. The priests called it sacred. The people called it divine. But within the palace walls, it was whispered by another name, the curse of the blood. It began quietly. The first signs were not rebellion, but resemblance. Children born of the rituals began to look too much like him, eyes the same, features mirrored, temper identical. At first, Xerxes took this as proof of his godhood. The blood is pure, he declared. It repeats the image of the divine. But the priests knew better. The children were not divine, they were deteriorating. Some were born weak, some never spoke, some laughed at the wrong times. A few grew into strange, brilliant beings who feared the sun, who drew maps on walls and whispered languages no one had taught them. The physicians called it a mystery of the gods. The mothers called it punishment. And still, the king demanded more. Each ritual was followed by sacrifice, not of animals, but of memory. Women were ordered to forget, to never speak the names of the children born from divine touch. They were raised by servants, unacknowledged, invisible. Yet the curse found its way into every chamber. The palace began to echo with a silence heavier than stone. One night, the queen, Amestris, broke that silence. She summoned the high seer, Arthabanes, into her private chamber and spoke without fear for the first time in years. "You have made the king believe he is a god," she said. "But what you've made of his children, that is not divine, that is horror wearing gold." Arthabanes bowed, his expression unreadable. "The divine cannot be judged by mortal eyes," he replied. "The divine?" Amestris spat. "Then tell me why the gods' children die before they learn to speak. Tell me why my daughter Amadas trembles when she hears her father's name. Tell me why your God must hide his holiness behind locked doors." For a moment, the priest said nothing. Then, with the calmness of a man who had already sold his soul, he answered, "Because holiness and madness share a single face, my queen. We serve whichever keeps the empire standing." That night, Amestris realized she was living in a temple built upon rot, and she made a decision no queen had ever made before her. She would destroy her husband's illusion, even if it meant burning herself with it. But rebellion in Xerxes' court was not declared with swords. It began in whispers. The queen began to speak secretly with the royal physicians, those who had seen the malformed heirs, the dying infants, the trembling mothers. She gathered fragments of truth like hidden embers. Every secret confession became a spark. One physician, an old man named Demosthenes, had been part of the first ritual decades earlier. His voice trembled when he spoke to the queen. "Majesty," he said, "what you call horror, the priests call order. They believe the empire survives because of his blood. They will not let the truth escape these walls." "Then we will burn the walls," she said coldly. But the priests were already watching her. The illusion could not survive exposure. They whispered to Xerxes that the queen was conspiring with foreign powers, that her womb had been touched by mortal hands, that her loyalty had grown impure. He believed them. When she confronted him, she found a man hollowed by his own mythology. "You are destroying your bloodline," she said. "You call yourself divine, yet you cannot create anything but death." Xerxes smiled faintly, the smile of a man who has forgotten what truth feels like. "Death," he said, "is how gods remind men to worship." "You are not a god," she whispered. "You are a grave wearing a crown." His eyes flickered. For a heartbeat, something human returned. Regret. Confusion. Then, just as quickly, it vanished. "The priests tell me purity must be preserved," he said. "Would you defy them?" "I would defy hell itself to save our children." That was her last act of defiance. By dawn, her attendants were executed. The physicians disappeared. And the queen was confined to her quarters, her words forbidden, her name erased from all decrees. But the curse had already taken root. The empire's next generation, his so-called divine heirs, began to turn against him. One of them, a boy named Samides, was said to bear not only his father's face, but also his defiance. He was 16 when he first questioned the priests publicly. "If we are gods," he said, "why do we fear silence so much?" The question was enough to seal his fate. He was executed quietly, recorded in history as a heretic unworthy of divine blood. Yet that execution did not restore fear. It revealed fracture. Servants began to whisper. Mothers wept too openly. Even some priests started to question the line they had helped draw between holiness and horror. The illusion that had ruled for decades began to splinter from within. Still, Xerxes refused to see it. The older he grew, the more desperate he became to preserve what was left of his divinity. He turned his own children into sacrifices to prove his immortality, yet each death only made him smaller. The greatest empire in the world was now ruled by a man terrified of his own blood. One night, Arthabanes approached him, trembling not with fear, but with pity. "My king," he said softly, "even gods tire of being gods." Xerxes' voice broke for the first time in years. "If I stop, they will see me as a man." "They already do," the priest said, "but none dare speak it." The king's hands shook. For a moment, the illusion cracked, but he sealed it again with rage. Then they must learn silence anew. And so began the final purge, the cleansing of all who carried the tainted blood of divinity. It was the purest act of madness ever committed in the name of holiness. By the time it ended, the palace was quieter than a tomb. The queen was gone, the priests lived in fear of their own scriptures, and the king, surrounded by portraits of himself, no longer recognized the faces of his children. The empire had been purified of its own future. Historians later wrote that Xerxes' decline began with his military defeats, but those who knew whispered differently. The fall of Persia began not on the battlefield, but in a bedroom, where a man tried to play God and ended up destroying everything human within him. His lineage, once celebrated as divine, became a cautionary myth, the story of a god who forgot that immortality begins with mercy, not blood. But that mercy was long gone, and the silence that followed would echo for centuries. No rebellion begins with a sword. It begins with a whisper that refuses to die. Amestris was never seen again in public after her confinement, but her absence became its own kind of presence. Servants spoke of hearing her voice in the corridors, not as a ghost, but as a reminder. The queen's silence had been meant to erase her. Instead, it gave her power. The women who served her, handmaidens, nurses, even the guards assigned to her quarters, began to memorize her words. When she spoke, they listened as if memorizing scripture. She never raised her voice, she didn't need to. Her rebellion lived in restraint. Power, she once told them, is not taken. It is starved. You don't fight the tyrant by killing him. You make him choke on his own silence. And so they began to starve him. The rebellion of Amestris was not fought in open defiance. It was waged through small, deliberate disobedience, the kind that erodes empires from within. Messages went missing. Rituals were delayed. Servants began to forget titles when addressing the king. Priests began to speak a little slower, question a little softer. At first, Xerxes dismissed it as negligence. But soon he noticed the unease, the glances exchanged, the sudden hush when he entered a room. Fear had not vanished, but it had changed direction. For the first time in years, it pointed back at him. Arthabanes, the high seer, felt it too. He warned the king that the queen's influence had not died, it had multiplied. Her silence, he said, is becoming doctrine. The women in your palace pray to her now. Xerxes' eyes narrowed. Pray to her? The priest hesitated. Not as goddess, as mercy. It was the first time in decades anyone had used that word in his presence. Mercy. The one virtue Xerxes had erased from his empire, now resurrected in whispers. He ordered a purge of her attendants, but it was already too late. The queen's rebellion had no leaders left to destroy. It had become a belief, a quiet refusal to worship the lie. Even the eunuchs, once symbols of absolute obedience, began to falter. They had witnessed too much. Some began leaving messages scratched into walls, short phrases that seemed meaningless until read together. The divine bleeds. The king remembers the blood. The gods are watching their own reflection. Xerxes ordered the messages erased, but more appeared. It was as though the palace itself had begun to speak. Meanwhile, in her confinement, Amestris continued her rebellion in the only way left to her, through memory. She began dictating her recollections to a servant girl who pretended to be illiterate. Night after night, they whispered the truth, the rituals, the corruption, the madness. Every word was a weapon. She knew the scrolls would never survive inside the palace, so she planned for them to escape disguised as holy texts. She had one trusted messenger, a stable boy named Naaman, whose parents had died during the purges. To him, she gave the words that would one day destroy a myth. "Naaman," she said quietly, "you will not live to see what these words do, but they will live. That is enough." He bowed, tears filling his eyes. "My queen, if they find me—" "They will," she interrupted gently, "but before they do, they will hear me." The next morning, Naaman was gone. The priests claimed he fled. Xerxes claimed divine punishment. But somewhere beyond the walls of Persepolis, the words of the forgotten queen began their slow journey through the empire, copied by scribes who didn't know their source, shared in markets by storytellers who called it a fable. The tale of the king who believed himself a god and destroyed his own blood. It would take years for that tale to grow teeth. But when it did, it would devour everything Xerxes built. Inside the palace, the king's paranoia became unbearable. He accused servants of conspiring with spirits, ordered priests to fast until they received visions of betrayal. Yet the visions never came. Even the gods seemed to grow silent. In desperation, he visited Amestress's quarters, the first time in years he had looked upon her. She sat calmly, her hair streaked with gray, her hands folded like a prayer. She did not rise. "You've turned my own house against me," he said quietly. "Even the air whispers your name." "It's not my name they whisper," she replied. "It's yours, followed by what you've done." His jaw tightened. "You think you can shame a god?" "I don't need to," she said softly. "The gods have already left you." He stepped closer, studying her face for some trace of fear. But there was none, only pity. And pity was something he could not bear. "You forget who I am," he hissed. "I forget nothing," she said. "That's why you fear me." He struck her. Once, hard, more out of desperation than anger. But she did not flinch. "Every time you raise your hand," she whispered, "you prove what you are not." He left her that night shaking, not from guilt, but from confusion. For the first time, her defiance did not feel like treason. It felt like truth. Arthabanes found him pacing hours later. The priest tried to calm him, but Xerxes' eyes were wild. "She doesn't fear me," he said. "Even the gods feared me once." "Why doesn't she?" "Because she has nothing left to lose," the priest answered. "Then I will take her silence," Xerxes said. But the priest said nothing. For the first time, even he was afraid, not of the king, but of the end he saw approaching. Days later, the queen was found unconscious. No one knew whether she had been poisoned or starved. The king ordered her buried in secret, without ceremony. The people were told she had ascended into divine union, but the rebellion did not die with her. It multiplied again, because silence, once broken, can never be restored. Her attendants began spreading her final words. "A god who kills his children is no god at all." Those words became fire. Priests repeated them in secret. Mothers whispered them to their daughters. Soldiers carved them into stone. And when Xerxes heard of it, he realized the truth too late. That his greatest enemy was not a foreign army, nor a disobedient queen, but an idea. That even in a kingdom built on fear, conscience remembers how to speak. The queen's rebellion had succeeded. She had turned silence itself into resistance. And in the years to come, when Xerxes' empire began to fracture, when generals defected and provinces revolted, none of them claimed to act in the name of conquest. They claimed to act in the name of mercy. Her word, the one he had tried to erase, had become the weapon that would undo him. Every empire eventually turns on its architects. For Xerxes, it began the night the gods stopped answering. The priests gathered in the inner sanctum as they always had, a circle of white robes and trembling faith. But that night, when they began their chants, something was different. The silence after the prayer was too long, too heavy. No wind stirred, no echoes replied. To them, it felt as if heaven itself had sealed its doors. Arthabanes, the high seer, tried to continue, but his voice cracked. He knew what the silence meant, not divine punishment, divine indifference. The gods had abandoned their own invention. Xerxes entered the chamber without warning. He moved slowly, eyes sunken but blazing with something deeper than fury, fear. The kind of fear only a man who believes himself immortal can feel when the illusion starts to bleed. "Why do the gods not answer me?" he asked, his tone almost pleading. Arthabanes bowed. "Perhaps, my king, they are testing your faith." "My faith?" Xerxes snapped. "I gave them my blood. I gave them my children. I burned the world in their name. What else do they want?" The other priests lowered their eyes. None dared to speak. But silence in that room was no longer safety. It was guilt. He began to circle them, his footsteps echoing like accusations. "You made me divine," he said. "You wrote it, you preached it, you swore to it before the people. Yet now the heavens are quiet. Tell me who lied, me or you?" Arthabanes fell to his knees. "We have never lied to you, Majesty." Xerxes leaned close, his whisper colder than any threat. "Then why do I feel human again?" The priest trembled. "Because even the divine must suffer, my lord." The king straightened, a faint smile twisting his face. "No, Arthabanes. Only mortals suffer." That was the last time the high seer spoke freely. The following morning, Xerxes declared that the priesthood had become corrupted, that they had tainted divine truth with their weakness. A decree was issued: all temples shall be purified. All priests shall prove their faith through ordeal. The ordeals were crueler than any punishment. Priests were forced to walk barefoot on hot embers, to fast until delirium, to recite scripture without error while their hands were bound and cut. Many broke. Some confessed to blasphemies that had never been spoken. Others simply refused to speak at all and were silenced forever. The empire watched in horror. The men who had once been the voices of God now begged for mercy from the same king they had made into one. Xerxes' paranoia deepened. He accused them of conspiring with the queen's ghost. He claimed they had hidden divine secrets from him, that they had known all along that he was not chosen, but cursed. Arthabanes was brought before him in chains. "Do you still believe I am divine?" Xerxes asked. The old man's lips trembled. "I believe, Majesty, that you have become what we made you, and that is punishment enough." The king's expression darkened. "So the gods mock me through your mouth?" "No, my king," Arthabanes whispered. "They pity you." That word, pity, struck deeper than any blade. In Xerxes' mind, pity was the opposite of power. To be pitied meant to be human again, stripped of eternity. He ordered Arthabanes executed, but not by ordinary means. He demanded a ritual, one that would purify the priest's soul by returning it to the source. The court understood what that meant. The execution was held privately, witnessed only by the king and a few chosen guards. It was said that Arthabanes did not scream. He looked at Xerxes until the end, and in his final breath he whispered something no one else heard. The next morning, Xerxes ordered every record bearing the high seer's name to be destroyed, but his paranoia did not fade. If anything, it grew stronger. Without the priests to control belief, the empire began to splinter. Local temples closed. Pilgrims refused to travel. The people whispered that the gods had turned their faces away, that Xerxes' divinity had been a fraud. Desperate to reclaim the illusion, the king declared himself the only voice of heaven. He abolished the priesthood entirely and proclaimed that he alone could speak to the divine realm. Anyone who prayed to another intermediary was guilty of treason. It was faith rewritten into tyranny. At first, the soldiers enforced it. But soldiers are men, and men bleed belief when it no longer feeds them. Without the priests, even the military lost its purpose. They began to obey from habit, not conviction. A captain once dared to ask, "Majesty, if you are the voice of the gods, why do you fear the silence?" He was executed within the hour. But questions like that never die with the man who asks them. They travel from soldier to servant, from servant to market, from market to the streets. And soon the empire began to murmur a new gospel. The gods have gone, and only madness rules their throne. Xerxes responded with fire. He ordered the temples destroyed, the scriptures burned, and the sacred idols melted into coins bearing his face. "Let them worship something they can spend," he said. His treasurers obeyed, but even they could see it, the beginning of the end. For without priests, there were no prayers. Without prayers, there was no faith. And without faith, even a god-king becomes nothing more than a frightened man in gold. At night, the king would sit alone with the ashes of the sacred scrolls, running his fingers through them like sand. He began speaking to the ghosts of those he had killed, begging them to remind him what the gods' voices used to sound like. Sometimes he thought he heard them, faint whispers in the dark, but they did not comfort him. They only repeated what Arthebanes had once said: even gods tire of being gods. He tried to drown those whispers in new rituals, bloodier, grander, more desperate. But every offering, every sacrifice brought only silence. The illusion that had once lifted him to heaven now dragged him deeper into a pit of his own making. And somewhere in the heart of his crumbling palace, a single truth began to take root among the terrified servants. The gods had not abandoned Xerxes. He had driven them away. By the time the last temple fell, even his most loyal guards began to avert their eyes when he passed. No one called him divine anymore. They called him the Hollow One, for the priests had fallen, but with them fell the only thing that had ever made him believe he was more than mortal. And in the silence that followed, Xerxes realized too late that he had destroyed the one mirror that ever reflected his illusion back to him. Every tyrant eventually faces the voice they cannot silence, their own blood. Xerxes had silenced his priests, buried his queen, erased his children, but one son remained. His name was Artaban, the youngest, born in secrecy, raised by a nurse who taught him to speak softly and listen deeper. The king had long forgotten he existed, a child too quiet to threaten him, too human to be noticed. But Artaban remembered everything. He remembered the whispers of the servants, the trembling of the physicians, the silent prayers of mothers who had lost their sons to the king's divine rituals. He had seen the ashes of scripture scattered across marble floors. And he had learned one lesson no one dared teach him. The truth is, the only weapon that wounds immortality. He waited years for the right moment. It came when the empire began to fracture. Provinces refused tribute, generals disobeyed orders, and the treasury whispered of rebellion. For the first time, Xerxes' word no longer carried the weight of a god. And so, at a royal council meant to reaffirm his divinity before the court, Artaban spoke. He did not kneel. He did not bow. He stood among the nobles and declared, "Father, I have come to speak what no man dares to say." The hall fell silent. Xerxes turned toward him slowly, as if the sound of the voice itself were sacrilege. "And what would you speak, my son?" Artaban met his gaze, calm, deliberate, unflinching. "The truth, the one you buried beneath crowns and corpses." Murmurs rippled through the court. Some guards reached for their swords, but Xerxes raised a hand. "Let him speak," he said. "Let my own blood judge me if he dares." And Artaban did. He spoke of the rituals, how the priests had forged divine scripture to justify sin, how the king had corrupted his lineage in the name of purity. He spoke of the queen's rebellion, her final words, her courage. He spoke of Arthebanes' execution and how the empire's faith had died with him. "You called it holiness," Artaban said, his voice steady. "But it was hunger, the hunger of a man who could not bear being human." The court froze. Xerxes' face did not change, but his hands trembled. "Lies," he whispered. "All lies." "Then let them prove me false," Artaban replied. "Bring forth the priests you executed, the mothers you silenced, the children who never learned to speak. Let them stand here and deny me." No one moved, no one could. Because they all knew, the dead do not lie. Xerxes rose from his throne, his voice cracking like a whip. "You speak treason against the divine blood that gave you life." "No," Artaban said. "I speak for the blood that gave me conscience." Those words struck harder than any blade. The nobles looked away. The guards hesitated. Even the king's most loyal men could feel something shifting, the illusion unraveling in real time. Xerxes descended the steps, each movement deliberate, like a predator circling prey. "Do you think truth can kill a god?" "No," Artaban said quietly, "but it can make men stop worshipping one." The king's rage turned cold. "You are your mother's son." "I am," Artaban said, "and that is the only reason I still know mercy." For a moment, the king faltered. The name of Amestris hung between them like a ghost refusing to leave. "She poisoned you with her pity," he said. "She tried to save you from it," Artaban replied. "But you mistook mercy for weakness. You mistook fear for faith, and now you stand alone, not because you are divine, but because even your shadow refuses to follow you." Xerxes' eyes burned. "You will die for this." "Then I will die as a man," Artaban said, "not as a myth built from madness." He turned to the council, voice rising. "You all served him out of fear. You called it devotion, but it was survival. You watched him destroy his own bloodline in the name of purity. You watched our faith become a weapon. If the gods are silent, it is not because they are gone, it is because they are ashamed of us. The words tore through the chamber like fire. Even the guards lowered their eyes. Xerxes' voice broke. Do you know what it means to challenge heaven? Yes, Ardavan said. It means I've stopped pretending to live in hell. The king lunged forward, striking his son across the face. The sound echoed through the hall. Ardavan did not flinch. Blood trickled from his lip, and he smiled faintly. See, he said softly, even gods bleed. That single sentence shattered the illusion. The council erupted, not in chaos, but in realization. The nobles began whispering. The guards stepped back. In that instant, Xerxes understood what every tyrant eventually learns. Fear is borrowed, and when the borrower stops believing, it returns to its rightful owner. He called for the executioners, but no one moved. The men who had once killed at his command now stared at him with pity. Do it yourselves, Ardavan said. Your god has no followers left. Xerxes turned on them all, shouting, pleading, threatening. I am chosen. I am eternal. The heavens cannot fall. But the heavens had already fallen inside him. He looked at Ardavan again, trembling. You would destroy me? I didn't destroy you, father, Ardavan said. You did that the moment you believed yourself untouchable. Silence consumed the hall. Then, slowly, one of the elders, a man who had served the court since Darius, removed his ring, the mark of royal allegiance, and placed it on the floor. Others followed. Within minutes, the chamber floor was littered with gold, a quiet rebellion of faith. Xerxes stared at it, lost. His voice came out small, almost childlike. If I am not divine, then what am I? Ardavan's answer was simple. A man who forgot how to love. The king's knees buckled. He sank to the floor, surrounded by the remnants of devotion, crowns, seals, coins, symbols of a vanished empire. For the first time in his life, Xerxes wept. Not for his sins, but for the emptiness that remained when they were all gone. Ardavan turned and walked away, leaving his father amid the ruins of belief. He did not flee. He did not hide, because truth, once spoken, needs no escape. That night, whispers spread through the palace. The god king had fallen to his own blood. Some called it betrayal. Others called it justice. But among the common people, a new name began to circulate. Ardavan, the truth speaker. And as his words traveled beyond the palace walls, they became prophecy. When the divine bleeds, the empire begins to heal. For the first time in generations, Persia dreamed not of gods, but of men capable of mercy. The throne that had once commanded nations now sat like a monument to disbelief. What Ardavan began with a few sentences spread faster than any rebellion could. By the next sunrise, the whispers that the god king had bled reached the far ends of the empire, and that alone was enough to turn fear into memory. Governors who once carved Xerxes' face into their coins ordered them melted down. Priests who once blessed his name erased it from their scrolls. Even the generals, those who had conquered under his banner, began to question whether their loyalty had been to a man or to madness dressed as majesty. Inside the palace, silence grew heavier than command. Xerxes no longer held counsel. He no longer ate among his servants. He spoke to no one except the empty walls of his throne room. He would sit for hours, staring at the throne itself, gold laced with carvings of winged lions and immortal warriors, and whisper, "They've forgotten." Then, louder, "They can't forget." But every echo answered him back in the same tone. "They already have." The throne that once elevated him now mocked him. He saw the faces of his dead sons carved in the designs, Arthabanes' defiant stare, the queen's last gaze, and finally Ardavan's calm eyes that never trembled. In those eyes, even in memory, Xerxes saw his own undoing. He began summoning guards who no longer existed, commanding executions for people who were already buried, giving orders to the air, and when no one obeyed, he called it treason. He tried to restore control the only way he knew, with fear. He decreed that anyone who spoke his son's name would have their tongue cut out. He ordered the temples rebuilt in his honor, demanded sacrifices of the loyal, and promised divine punishment for those who doubted his immortality. But nothing came. No thunder, no rebellion of heaven, no sign of the gods who once legitimized his rule. The priests refused his summons. The treasury ran dry. Soldiers began to desert, and the throne, that cursed symbol of his immortality, remained unmoved, unguarded, unwanted. One evening, as he sat alone, Xerxes heard footsteps. He looked up, expecting guards, maybe assassins. Instead, it was an old servant, one who had attended his father, Darius, decades ago. His beard was white, his eyes tired but fearless. The king's voice cracked. "Why have you come?" The servant bowed faintly. "To see if you remember what it means to be human." Xerxes clenched his fists. "Do not mock me." "I don't," the servant said quietly, "but I remember when your father ruled not as a god, but as a man who earned loyalty." "You have no loyalty left, Majesty, only memory." The king rose, trembling. "I am not my father." "No," the servant said, "and that is the tragedy." For the first time in years, Xerxes had no reply. When the servant left, he ordered no punishment. He simply sat again on the throne, and for the first time it felt heavy, almost unbearable. The seat that had once made him divine now felt like judgment. Days passed, and the palace began to empty. Nobles fled, slaves vanished, and the corridors echoed only with his own mutterings. He called out to his mother, to his priests, to his sons. None answered. Then came the moment of collapse. Not a battle, not an assassination, but silence. It began when a messenger entered the throne room unannounced, pale and shaking. "Sire," he said, falling to his knees, "the banners of Babylon have fallen. The satraps have declared independence. They no longer send tribute." Xerxes didn't answer. He only smiled faintly. "Let them." The messenger hesitated. "And the army, sire, they march not under your standard, but under the banner of the truth speaker." The words hung in the air like a final curse. "Artavan." The king rose slowly, his body frail but his rage alive. "He dares," the messenger interrupted, trembling. "They say he does not seek the throne, Majesty, only to restore the faith you destroyed." Xerxes froze. For years he had imagined rebellion as ambition, betrayal as hunger for power. But this was worse. It was cleansing, and it came from his own blood. He dismissed the messenger with a wave and sank back onto the throne. His fingers dug into the gold as if it were flesh. "He took everything," he whispered, "even my immortality." And then, as if some part of him finally gave way, he began to laugh. The sound was not laughter of amusement, but of realization. "So this is what it means to be a god," he muttered. "To watch your worshippers become men again." He looked at his trembling hands. "I built an empire of fear. I thought it would last forever, but fear dies the moment it's seen in daylight." He stood one last time, looking down at the throne, the symbol of everything he had destroyed and lost. "You are the cruelest of all my creations," he said to it. "You gave me power, and in return you took away my soul." Then, without warning, he struck the throne, not in rage, but in defeat. The crown slipped from his head, rolled across the floor, and stopped at the base of the steps. No one came to pick it up. That night, Xerxes vanished from the palace. Some said he walked into the catacombs beneath Persepolis. Others said he went into exile disguised as a commoner. None truly knew. But one rumor endured, that he was last seen kneeling before the broken statue of his father, whispering, "Forgive me for what I made of your name." In the years that followed, the empire fractured, but it did not die. It transformed. Artavan never claimed the throne. Instead, he formed a council of voices. Soldiers, scholars, mothers, healers, all chosen not by birth, but by merit. He restored the temples, not to gods, but to justice. And yet, in every reform, one rule remained sacred: no man shall be called divine again. The old palace was left untouched, its throne room sealed behind iron doors, a warning to every ruler who dreamed of being more than human. Centuries later, when historians spoke of Xerxes, they did not call him the Great. They called him the last god king. And somewhere, buried beneath the marble that once echoed with his commands, lay the whisper of his own downfall. The truth that ended empires. When power forgets its humanity, even thrones turn to dust. Death forgot him. That was the punishment the heavens chose, not execution, not fire, but remembrance. For the man who once believed himself eternal, oblivion would have been mercy. Instead, Xerxes was condemned to live with what he had destroyed, his name, his legacy, and the echo of every voice he had silenced. The priests had vanished, the empire divided, and yet, whispers of the god-king still clung to the corners of Persia like a curse that refused to die. Farmers told their children that if you spoke lies beneath the moon, the spirit of Xerxes would hear and mark your tongue black by dawn. Mothers warned that disobedient sons might be chosen by the wandering king, taken to serve his eternal court of shadows. But beneath all those myths, one story endured, the story of a man who never died. Years after his disappearance, travelers began reporting strange encounters. A beggar who spoke like a scholar, refusing food but asking, "Do you still worship your kings?" A madman seen near the ruins of Persepolis, whispering the names of children long dead. And once, in a deserted temple, a soldier claimed to have found an inscription carved in trembling letters: "To be eternal is to never escape yourself." Those who read it said it was written in the king's own hand. Whether the tales were true or madness, they spread. And with every telling, the myth of Xerxes changed shape. He became less of a ruler and more of a symbol, the ghost of pride that haunted men who forgot they were mortal. Some said he wandered the mountains, seeking forgiveness from the spirits of his sons. Others claimed he had been cursed by the remnants of the priesthood, condemned to walk the earth unseen until the last trace of his bloodline vanished. But in every version, one detail remained: his eyes. Every witness described them the same: eyes that had seen too much power to ever close again. One account, recorded decades later by a traveling historian, spoke of an encounter in a small village near the eastern border. The historian wrote, "I found a man sitting by the road, clothed in rags yet speaking in the tongue of nobles. He asked me what I knew of truth. When I told him truth was the light of gods, he laughed. A sound so hollow I felt it in my bones. 'No,' he said, 'truth is what remains when gods stop watching.' I asked his name, and he replied, 'I have been called by many, but once I was worshipped.' He turned his face toward me then, and I swear by all the stars, I saw the eyes of a man who had outlived forgiveness." The historian burned his notes years later, saying the encounter had cursed him with dreams of a throne sinking into blood. Others told of Xerxes appearing to rulers in their sleep, warning them of the price of immortality. A prince in Bactria claimed that the king appeared at his bedside, whispering, "Every god ends when his sons learn to speak." The prince never slept again, and so the legend became immoral, a warning written in rumor. When Artavan died decades later, he ordered no statues, no temples, no golden tomb. His final decree read, "Let no king be remembered for his bloodline. Let him be remembered for the truth he allowed to live." But even as the world moved on, Xerxes' shadow remained, not as a name, but as a silence. Historians could never agree on where he died. Some said he was buried beneath the ruins of the throne room he once ruled. Others believed he walked east and vanished into lands unknown. But among those who study the old empires, one chilling fragment is often repeated: the god who feared mortality was granted eternity, not of life, but of conscience. They called it the curse of immortality. It was said that Xerxes' soul could not rest because his reign had rewritten the order of life and death. By declaring himself divine, he had forced the heavens to prove otherwise, and their judgment was ironic. Immortality without worship, eternity without peace. For centuries, strange anomalies surrounded his name. Entire dynasties that tried to resurrect his titles met ruin. Temples built in his honor collapsed. And those who sought to speak his forgotten language reportedly went mad, haunted by voices calling from within the stone. One scholar from Alexandria, centuries later, described it best: "There are two kinds of eternity, the kind the righteous ascend to, and the kind tyrants are buried in." Xerxes lives in the latter, not among gods, but among regrets that never die. Somewhere in the imagination of the empire he once ruled, he remained, a figure sitting on a throne that existed only in memory, still whispering his justifications into the void. He would ask invisible priests for counsel, summon armies that never came, and order executions for enemies long turned to dust. That was his afterlife, to relive his power endlessly, in a kingdom of silence where only guilt answered back. But his curse carried one last irony. The same people who once worshipped him now spoke his story to their children, not as praise, but as warning. and in that way his immortality survived through the very humanity he had tried to erase. Generations later, bards would end their tales with the same closing line, whispered as both prayer and curse: "Beware the man who would be a god, for he will never die and never live again." Thus Xerxes remained, not in stone, not in scripture, but in the conscience of history itself, a reminder that power can defy death, but never the truth that exposes it. And so his punishment was fulfilled. The world forgot to worship him, but never forgot what he did. History is filled with graves, but few are as feared as the one no one dares to name. Centuries after the reign of Xerxes, long after the empire he built had turned to dust, the scholars of new dynasties began to seek him, not to honor him, but to understand how a man could nearly erase humanity from power itself. They searched for his resting place, the tomb of the god who bled. Yet the irony of immortality lingered. There was no tomb. Every royal crypt in Persia was catalogued, restored, and recorded, except one. No inscription bore his name, no monument stood in his likeness. It was as though the world had conspired to forget his body, while his curse endured in memory. But forgetting is never perfect. One record, buried in the archives of Babylon, mentioned a sealed chamber beneath the city of the thousand fires. Another, written in Greek, described a king entombed not by builders but by those who feared him still. And in the 3rd century BCE, a scholar named Callisthenes of Rhodes claimed he had found it. According to his surviving fragments, he was led by an old shepherd to a hidden valley north of Persepolis. The man spoke of voices in the earth, of doors that whispered prayers backward. He refused to go near, saying the ground was cursed, that it swallowed names whole. Callisthenes went alone. He returned 3 days later, half mad and blind in one eye. His writings were the only trace of what he saw. "I found not a tomb, but a mirror made of stone. On its surface my reflection wept blood." There were inscriptions, but none bore a name, only the word, "forgiven." He never spoke again. His students said that in his final days he begged to be buried far from Persia, muttering, "The king is not dead. He waits for belief." The tale spread across generations. Some said Callisthenes had uncovered Xerxes' true resting place, a chamber built by those who sought to trap his spirit, not honor it. Others said he had simply gone mad chasing myth. Yet one truth persisted: wherever the tomb was, it had no name. In later centuries, kings who sought to claim divine lineage ordered expeditions to find it. None returned. One army of diggers vanished completely. The few survivors who crawled back to their cities spoke of labyrinthine passages filled with carved eyes, hundreds of them, all watching, all bleeding dust. The priests declared the site forbidden. The maps were burned. The name of Xerxes was erased again, not from shame this time, but from fear. But curiosity is the most patient curse of all. In 1289, a group of scholars under the Abbasid Caliphate rediscovered fragments of Callisthenes' notes. They followed his clues and unearthed a vast stone vault buried deep beneath layers of forgotten earth. Inside, they found carvings unlike any known Persian art, scenes of kings kneeling before their sons, queens holding shattered crowns, and above them, a figure with no face seated on a throne. One of the scholars, a scribe named Ibrahim al-Tusi, described it in his final journal entry. The air was heavy with silence. Upon the altar lay a slab of obsidian, carved with words not of worship but warning. "Do not awaken him who asked to never die." We sealed the chamber again, for some truths are not to be learned, only feared. Weeks later, the team perished from unknown causes. The caliph ordered the expedition erased from records, but a copy of Ibrahim's journal survived, smuggled by one of his apprentices. It became known in seeker circles as the Testament of the Nameless King. From then on, Xerxes' tomb became less of a destination and more of a test. Those who sought it were said to be drawn not by history, but by hunger, the same hunger that destroyed the king himself. Every few centuries, new seekers emerged, explorers, mystics, even emperors. They all vanished, and each time, local legend whispered the same omen: he accepts no visitors, only replacements. By the time of modern archaeology, the myth had hardened into taboo. Scholars would speak of Xerxes only in passing, never invoking his name in excavation journals. One researcher from Oxford called it the single historical figure whose absence is more powerful than his existence. Still, There were rumors. In 1934, during the excavation of an ancient necropolis near Fars, workers uncovered a sealed stairway descending into the earth. The passage was lined with inscriptions written in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and an unknown script that resembled no other. At the bottom lay a black chamber, empty but for a single broken diadem and the faint trace of human ashes. When the lead archaeologist recorded the discovery, every reel of footage from that expedition was later destroyed in a mysterious fire. The official report listed the site as an unfinished burial structure of minor historical significance. But witnesses recalled something else, a chilling message etched into the final step of the stairway: he who was not buried cannot be found. And so, the legend endured, the tomb without a name, guarded not by soldiers or stone, but by silence. Even now, the absence itself is its own kind of presence. Xerxes' body was never found, yet his myth has survived every empire that followed. He became the warning every historian whispers before sealing a vault: do not dig too deep for the gods you made yourself, because some rulers leave behind monuments. Xerxes left behind a void, and in that void lies the last truth of immortality, that to be forgotten by the world is a blessing, but to be remembered by history as its curse, that is eternal. Thus the tomb without a name remains, neither found nor lost, existing wherever power demands worship and truth demands silence. And those who still seek it know this. They do not search for bones. They search for the reflection that once called itself divine. Centuries turned into dust, yet the image of Xerxes refused to fade. He no longer existed in the world of monuments or scriptures, but in something far more indestructible: the human desire to be worshipped. Every empire that rose after him carried a fragment of his shadow. Kings who declared themselves chosen, rulers who called their will divine, all unknowingly repeated the same ritual. Xerxes began the illusion of godhood, and in every one of them history whispered the same warning: beware the reflection. Because Xerxes had never died, he had only changed mirrors. Whenever a tyrant looked upon himself and saw not a man but a savior, Xerxes returned, not in body, not in name, but in spirit, the undying hunger to control what cannot be controlled, reverence. It was said that in the age of Alexander, as the Macedonian conqueror stood before the ruins of Persepolis, he paused before a cracked stone that once bore the name of the Persian king. He sought eternity, Alexander murmured, but found himself. Then he ordered the ruins left untouched, a gesture not of respect, but of fear. Even centuries later, in the courts of Rome, scholars spoke of the curse of the Eastern god-king. One philosopher warned an emperor that to be adored beyond one's humanity was to invite the eyes of Xerxes upon you. The emperor laughed, and within a year he was murdered by his own guard. The legend persisted. It evolved from myth into metaphor, from curse into counsel. Statesmen quoted it. Prophets reimagined it. Poets carved it into verse. The mirror of kings remembers every lie. Yet the truth was more unsettling. The curse of Xerxes was not a ghost haunting palaces. It was the human condition itself, the endless reflection of pride in the glass of power. In one apocryphal text discovered in the 17th century, a monk claimed he had dreamed of a hall filled with mirrors, each reflecting the face of a different ruler. But among them all, one image was constant: the same calm, ageless stare. When the monk asked who it was, a voice replied, "He is the beginning and the end of every throne." The monk woke screaming, his hair turned white. He spent the rest of his life painting mirrors black. Even now, historians debate whether Xerxes' curse was superstition or psychological truth. But the deeper one studies his story, the more it feels like prophecy. He began as a man taught to believe in divine right, that blood could sanctify cruelty, that obedience could masquerade as worship. Yet what destroyed him was not rebellion or war. It was recognition. His son's defiance shattered the illusion he lived by, and in doing so, freed humanity from a god they never needed. But illusions are persistent. They resurface in new forms, in crowns, in flags, in ideologies that promise perfection. And each time, the same pattern returns. A ruler forgets his limits, a people surrender their will, and the mirror of Xerxes gleams again. His story became a cycle, repeating not through time, but through ego. Somewhere, in the depths of forgotten archives, an ancient inscription survives, the last known words attributed to Xerxes himself, scratched into obsidian so faintly it can barely be seen. I looked into my reflection and saw eternity. I looked again and saw my absence. It is said those who read the inscription feel an inexplicable chill, not from fear, but from recognition, because every person who seeks control over others, every soul who craves worship instead of understanding, carries a spark of the same curse. That is why his reflection endures. Xerxes no longer needs temples or priests. His immortality lies in every act of arrogance disguised as destiny. Every time a leader silences truth, every time a voice calls itself divine, the mirror forms, and the reflection stares back, whispering, "I have returned." Perhaps that is the true meaning of immortality, not to live forever, but to never stop repeating. And so, when the scholars of the modern age speak of Xerxes, they do not call him king or tyrant. They call him the first mirror, the one who showed humanity what happens when power devours the soul that wields it. In the end, he became what he always feared, a god with no believers, a king with no kingdom, a man who could never die, because no one ever truly learns from him. And if you stand before a mirror long enough, if you look deep enough into your own reflection, you might understand the curse that bound him. Not the curse of immortality, but the curse of seeing yourself exactly as you are and being unable to look away. That was Xerxes' final punishment, and it remains humanity's eternal reflection. They say the gods once spoke through kings, but history remembers what the heavens forget, that when a man declares himself divine, he stops being human long before he stops breathing. Xerxes was not the first to chase eternity, and he won't be the last. His empire may have fallen into sand, but his reflection survived the collapse, not in stone or scripture, but in every ruler who mistook obedience for faith and fear for loyalty. His bloodline died centuries ago, but his shadow didn't. It lingers, in the halls of power, in the hearts of those who believe they are untouchable, and in the silence of every truth that's been buried to protect a throne. Because that's the true curse of immortality, not to live forever, but to never stop repeating the same sin. And maybe that's why no one ever found his tomb. Maybe the tomb isn't buried beneath the earth, but beneath us. In every generation that forgets how easily men can turn into myths, and myths into monsters. Xerxes wanted to be remembered as a god. He succeeded, but not in the way he dreamed. Today, his name survives not as a symbol of divinity, but as a mirror, a warning, a reflection of everything power demands and everything it destroys. Look long enough into that mirror and you'll see him staring back, not as a king, not as a ghost, but as the part of us that still hungers for control. And when you do, remember this. It isn't Xerxes who never died, it's the arrogance that built his throne.